Coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been in Hong Kong now for 25 years, so it's a real delight to be back here again. I have an opportunity to visit. So what I want to do today is describe a little bit what we might expect from Paris. Paris is going to be held in only about 4 weeks, so you'll have a chance to see how well next things turn out quite quickly. So it's always a little dangerous to be predicting. I like the phrase, prediction is difficulty, especially about the future, and that's true of the climate change regime. So what I want to do today is provide, first of all, a little bit of background on the evolution of the climate change regime, a little bit about lessons learned. Thank you. Lessons learned, what we can take away from the experience we've had so far. Then I want to provide some framing for the Paris meeting, some of the context and ways of thinking about what the outcome might look like, and then try to give some predictions, overview about where things are heading for Paris. So I like to describe the development of the climate change regime as a play in 4 acts. Act 1 is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992. Act 2 is the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. Act 3 was the Copenhagen Cancun framework, which was adopted in 2009-2010. And we're now in the midst of Act 4, which is supposed to culminate next month in Paris. And we still don't know how the play is going to end, what the finale is, but we have had quite a lot of developments so far. So what I want to do is just briefly walk through this history, just to provide some context for the Paris meeting next month. So the Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in 1992, and it essentially acts as the constitution for the climate change regime. So like a constitution, it establishes the system of governance. And that includes the basic institutions, most importantly the Conference of the Party, or COP, which is the meeting held every year of the parties to the Framework Convention, establishes some very general obligations and principles. The obligations primarily pertain to reporting. Probably the most important of the principles, the one that gets the most attention, is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is the basis for some kind of differentiation in terms of what different countries are expected to do. And then it establishes an overall objective of the regime, namely to stabilize atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at safe levels. The Framework Convention was adopted, as I said, in 1992, and essentially now has universal participation, 195 countries around the world. So the Framework Convention did not establish specific obligations on countries to reduce emissions. The only thing it said about reducing emissions was that developed countries were supposed to aim to return emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2000. But it didn't set any binding obligations on countries to reduce emissions. And so the next phase in the development of the climate change regime was the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which for the first time set emission reduction targets. So I like to describe the Kyoto Protocol as having essentially three elements. So the first is that it established internationally negotiated and agreed limits on greenhouse gas emissions. And these were economy-wide limits. They were absolute. They were relative to a 1990 baseline level. They applied for 5 years from 2008 to 2012. And associated with this was a market-based architecture that allowed countries to implement their emission reduction targets through emissions trading, undertaking projects in developing countries through the Clean Development Mechanism, and so forth. So the first element is what I call a top-down architecture, in that the targets that were agreed to in Kyoto were internationally negotiated. They weren't nationally decided, they were internationally negotiated. The US, for example, when it went into Kyoto, wanted a stabilization target, a 0% reduction target. We came out of Kyoto with a -7% reduction target. So the target the US ended up with was not the target we would have chosen if we were just choosing a target on our own. It was an internationally negotiated target. We had to agree to it, of course, but it wasn't something that we chose on our own. So in that sense, it was a top-down regulatory approach. Second feature of Kyoto, the targets were legally binding. They were legally binding targets. And they weren't just legally binding, but they were specified to a high degree of specificity through international rules. So there were very detailed rules about how you did your accounting. And essentially, compliance with Kyoto's targets was a mathematical equation that you could calculate with some exactitude. So that's the second feature, legally binding. And then the third feature is extreme differentiation. So these legally binding absolute emissions targets, quantitatively defined, only apply to developed countries. Developing countries, from day one in the negotiations, the negotiating mandate set no new commitments for developing countries. So a very, very strict form of differentiation between developed countries that have legally binding targets and developing countries that didn't. So Kyoto was adopted in 1997. It required another 4 years of negotiations after 1997 to work out the rules for how it was going to work. So rules about how you would account for sinks, for example, all the detailed rules for how you would engage in emissions trading, undertake projects through the clean development mechanism. So another 4 years of negotiations to work out the rules. So I would say, in a sense, the Kyoto Protocol negotiations weren't finished until 2001 when the Marrakesh Accords were adopted. And then there was another 3-year period of trying to get Kyoto into force because the US, of course, said it wasn't going to participate. So that then, because of the entry into force requirements, required basically everyone else to participate, including Russia. So that was another several years. So the Kyoto Protocol phase of this, Act 2 as I call it, really ran from 1995 when the negotiations began through 2005. So then Act 3 was the Copenhagen Cancun phase. And really I think Act 3 is largely about trying to expand the regime from just dealing with developed country emissions, which is what Kyoto did. Kyoto only applied to developed country emissions, trying to expand the regime to apply to emissions more generally. And essentially, I think you can think about the Copenhagen Cancun Accord in the context of the 3 elements of Kyoto I mentioned. It's basically the negation, the opposites in each context, in each case from Kyoto. So Kyoto had internationally negotiated top-down targets. Copenhagen had bottom-up pledges that were nationally determined. Each country decided on its own what it was going to come forward and say it was going to do. And there was no international review of that, no international negotiation. Whatever you put on the table in Copenhagen, that was what your pledge was going to be. These pledges were not legally binding. They were simply political commitments. And then, in contrast to Kyoto, where only developed countries had emissions targets, the Copenhagen Cancun framework applied much more generally. So all the big developing countries came forward with pledges under Copenhagen Cancun. So this is just illustrating why in this third phase it was seen as so important to expand the regime. If you look at this and you look back in 1992 when the Framework Convention was adopted, the US by far the biggest emitter, followed by the EU. China's down here, India is considerably lower. Even in 1997 when Kyoto was adopted, the US is still the biggest emitter, followed by the EU. But now, in the period when Copenhagen Cancun were adopted, China's emissions have gone way, way up. India's emissions have gone way, way up. Basically a recognition that you just can't deal with a climate change problem unless you have a much broader participation. You need to have a global approach rather than simply an approach focusing on developed countries. So while the second phase, the Kyoto phase, was largely about developed country emissions, it was largely a negotiation between the US and the EU. I think that was the basic negotiating dynamic. The third phase, the Copenhagen Cancun phase, was really a negotiation between developed and developing countries about how to broaden the regime to include developing countries. So the third phase, Copenhagen Cancun, Copenhagen Accord, that was never was adopted by the conference due to opposition by some countries. It wasn't until the following year in Cancun that the Copenhagen Accord was essentially formalized and brought into the UNFCCC process. So what Copenhagen Cancun dealt with was the period up to 2020. So immediately upon the Copenhagen Cancun being finished, attention turned to what to do post-2020. And essentially, I should mention, in the period up to 2020, Kyoto still continues, but then it's supplemented with Copenhagen Cancun. So the fourth phase is the act we're in now. That's the negotiations of a new agreement for Paris, dealing with the period from 2020. And the basis for the current negotiation is the so-called Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, which was adopted at the Durban Conference. Parties agreed to launch a process to develop a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome of legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. And this agreement is supposed to be reached by 2015 in Paris at COP21. And there's no reference, interestingly, in the Durban Platform to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities. In fact, no mention of any differentiation at all. So an important, I think, parameter or feature of the current negotiations. So I think one way of thinking about the Durban platform negotiations is essentially how much will it look like Kyoto, or how much will it look like Copenhagen, Cancun. So will it be the top-down regulatory approach, international negotiated targets, or will it be a bottom-up process? Will it be legally binding, or will it be a softer form of commitment? Will it have this sharp differentiation between developed and developing countries, or will it have more symmetry or parallelism between the two groups of countries? Now, having given a little bit of background for where we are now, I want to provide a little bit of context and different ways of thinking about what the Paris outcome might look like. So I think it's important, any negotiation you do, to start with the question, what is the goal? What are you trying to achieve? And you might think it's obvious, but I actually think different countries have different views as to what the goal of the negotiations is. So I at least think of the goal as what I call here environmental effectiveness or climate effectiveness, which is measured simply as the most reductions in emissions you can get. We're not going to get enough reductions, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Whatever is accomplished in Copenhagen won't be enough to get us on a pathway to limiting climate change to 2 degrees. So what's the most emission reduction we can get? And it's not just emission reduction at any point in time, it's emission reductions over time. It's a dynamic problem. So even if the negotiations end with something that starts relatively mild in reductions, if it can build over time and lead to further reductions in the future, then it's better than something that starts higher but never goes anywhere, as I would argue is the case with Kyoto. So how do you maximize environmental effectiveness over time, emission reductions over time? And this is a function not just of how ambitious the targets are in Copenhagen, in Paris. It's also a function of how many countries participate and how many countries comply. Because you can have extremely strong emission reduction requirements, but if countries don't participate or if they don't comply with them, you haven't gotten anywhere. And the problem is, these are 3 interdependent variables. The more you push on ambition, it may lead to less participation or less compliance. On the other hand, if you aim very low to get everybody to participate, you might have something that's so unambitious it doesn't accomplish anything. So how do you get a balance between these 3 to maximize the output that you want, which is emission reductions over time? Now, the other thing I just want to say by way of sort of context for this is that is to ask the question, what's the role of international law or the climate change regime in trying to effectuate this goal of environmental effectiveness and emission reductions? And I like to think about this in terms of 3 different models for how law can work. 3 different models. A prescriptive model where the law simply tells you what you have to do. A contractual model where the agreement sort of reflects a bargain or, between the different participants. Or a facilitative catalytic model where the agreement catalyzes or encourages action but doesn't require countries to do anything. So let me just walk through these in turn and sort of provide my perspective on what the role, I think, realistically of what Paris might do is. So the prescriptive model is the model that we think about with domestic law, with national law, where you can simply have a legislature that can decide what the law is, and then you have police or other enforcement tools that can then make people obey the law. And you can have winners and losers. In fact, in most legislation benefits some and disadvantages others, and the losers have to follow it because they don't have a choice. It's legislated on them. If they violate it, there are consequences. So essentially, law is acting like a hammer, in a way. It's like a hammer getting countries to do what the law tells them to do. Now, the problem with this model, which I think is the way a lot of people, particularly environmental NGOs, sometimes think about what the negotiations should do in Paris, where we simply tell countries you've got to do X or Y or Z, and then force them to do so. The problem is international law really doesn't work very well that way, because international law is an extremely small hammer, very, very, almost infinitesimal hammer, trying to drive a very, very big nail, and the very big nail is human behavior. All of the different human behaviors that are causing climate change. Energy consumption, transportation, consumption of goods generally, agriculture, and so forth and so on. So you're trying to change basically fundamental parts of countries' economies, very, very deeply entrenched parts of countries' economies, with this teeny-weeny little hammer, international law. So a first question, if people are pushing a prescriptive model, is why would countries agree in Paris to an outcome that leaves them worse off? Why would anybody, country in Paris agree? I was just giving some talks in Shanghai to a group of environmental officials, and people said, well, but Paris is going to be so high profile, countries will feel forced to agree because they won't want to take the blame. So my reaction to that is, first of all, I'm not so sure that's the case. Countries will really do things that they don't think are going to leave them better off. They're going to leave them worse off just because of international pressure. But even if that were true, and they agreed in Paris, there's a question about whether they would actually comply. Once they get home from Paris, and the international spotlight's no longer on them, will they actually follow through? So I think there's some fundamental problems with thinking about Paris as being able to actually prescribe anything, actually being able to tell countries what they have to do. So the model that international law, I think, generally uses is not a prescriptive model, it's a contractual model. This is essentially the basis for treaties. Treaties are contracts between states. They're based on reciprocity, where one country agrees to do something in exchange for other countries doing something, and like a contract, they leave everyone better off. A fundamental idea, I think, in treaty law, like any contract, is that everybody has to be better off as a result of the agreement. Otherwise, they wouldn't want to accept the agreement. So this is what economists call Pareto superiority, that everyone has to be better off. It's integrative or interest-based bargaining, getting to yes kind of bargaining. And there needs to be some kind of contract zone where there's an agreement that everybody perceives leaves them better off. This, I think, was the basis for the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, where EU accepted the -8 target, Japan accepted the -6 target, the US said they were going to accept the -7 target and then didn't. But basically, each of these targets were taken on in exchange for, through international negotiations, in exchange for reciprocal commitments by other countries. Now, the contractual model, though, I don't think is working so well in the climate negotiations. These are two pictures from the Copenhagen meeting. And in Copenhagen, it really wasn't clear what they were doing, whether they were trying to do contractual or something different. So the bottom picture is Ivo de Boer, who was then the executive secretary of the Climate Change Secretariat, not having a good day. Top picture, the various delegations the last night in Copenhagen, exhausted from having been up for 36 plus hours. Negotiations aren't that easy, and I think we have to ask, why is the contractual model not working so well? Why are countries going into Paris basically bargaining with one another about what they're going to do to reduce emissions? And I think the basic problem is that the climate change issue is really much less an international issue in political terms and much more a domestic issue in political terms, because basically the issues are so fundamental in domestic politics, energy policy, transportation policy, agricultural policy, and so forth, that it's driven by domestic politics much more than it's driven by international politics. I don't think it's the case that most countries are really willing to do more on climate change simply because somebody else is doing more, because what they're going to do on climate change is much more a function of their domestic politics than it is a function of international politics. The U.S. is not going to be doing more in exchange for others. The U.S. Clean Power Plan is a function of what President Obama thinks the U.S. can do under the Clean Air Act, and regardless of what anybody else is doing. So the contractual model, I think, has not been very successful. It's been very successful in many contexts. It's successful, I think, in WTO on trade, successful in arms control agreements. In many contexts, the issue is much more an international issue where international bargaining and reciprocity and contracting really does work. But in the climate change context, I just don't think it transfers over very well, because climate change is such a fundamental issue in domestic politics. So what does that leave us with by process of elimination? We're left with a relatively weak model here, what I call the facilitator model. And the theory of the facilitator model, if it really is going to do anything, is that states are willing to do, the premise is states are willing to do something, actually are interested to do something on climate change. And the role of international politics is basically to help facilitate them to do things, is to try to encourage them to do things, to do as best they can, try to give them a helping hand, so to speak, a facilitated hand. So international regime can help raise attention so that domestic elements that want to take action on climate change then have more of a forum or an opportunity or platform to do things. I think 150 countries, as I'll talk about in a minute, have now come forward with their nationally determined contributions for Paris. I don't think that would have happened but for the fact that the Paris Agreement is coming up. It's not that Paris has forced them to do anything. It's that Paris has provided a context in which within countries, it's easier now, or there's a basis for countries trying to come forward with national climate change policies. Transparency can help exert some kind of very soft pressure on countries to sort of live up to what they said they're going to do. And then in some countries, of course, a country might want to do something on climate change, but simply lack the capacity to be able to do so. So to the extent the international regime is providing some assistance, either financial assistance, technical assistance, capacity building more generally, then the international regime is not forcing anyone to do anything, but it's helping assist countries that have an interest in doing something to be able to do so. All right, so that's providing a little bit of context for Paris, what it might realistically achieve. So turning back to the negotiations more specifically, so what are the lessons learned from the 3 acts that we've had so far? So Kyoto was relatively strong in terms of its rigor, very detailed accounting rules, but very small participation and shrinking participation. The countries that were willing to take on second commitment period targets under Kyoto now represent only about 13% of global emissions, actually probably less than 13% because we now know Chinese emissions were higher than otherwise believed, so overall emissions are higher. So anyway, the very small, relatively small fraction of global emissions are actually covered under the Kyoto approach. Copenhagen Cancun, in contrast, has very broad participation, but quite low ambition. More than 90 pledges covering more than 80% of emissions globally, but those targets, those pledges, are well short of a 2-degree pathway for temperature. So this is just illustrating these last 2 points. So the dark blue are the countries that have Kyoto targets. The lighter shades of blue are different forms of Copenhagen Cancun pledges. So you can see much, much greater global participation in the Copenhagen Cancun system than in the Kyoto system. But the Copenhagen pledges leave us with what's called an emissions gap. So this little black square there is 2020. So that's what people calculate the Copenhagen Cancun pledges will add up to. That's where the emissions will be. And these are different pathways to get us to, I think it's 1 degree, 1.5 degrees is green, 2 degrees is yellow. So if you want to be in a 2-degree pathway, you need to be somewhere in this yellow band. And you can see the Copenhagen Cancun pledges put us on a pathway to a much bigger temperature increase than what's been globally agreed. So what are the implications then of this for Paris? So what people are talking about for Paris, and I think what the agreement is looking like, is some form of hybrid approach that combines elements of the bottom-up approach of Copenhagen and the top-down approach of Kyoto. So you have national flexibility to promote participation, to allow different countries to do different things and experiment, to actually have more ambitious pledges in some contexts because they have, they're not going to be legally bound, so they have a little more latitude to take risks. On the other hand, you have international rules to promote transparency and accountability and to promote reciprocity. So hybridity in the Paris Agreement, nationally, the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement is going to be nationally determined contributions. So these are what countries pledge to do in terms of reducing their emissions, but they're nationally determined, so there's a lot of flexibility here. But then you combine that with some kind of multilateral rules. In Copenhagen, there were really almost no multilateral rules. The Copenhagen pledges had almost no discipline to them. In fact, it was almost impossible to figure out what the Copenhagen pledges in many cases actually meant because they were not specified very, very clearly. So the idea is that you have, rules on the formulation, presentation, and recording of NDCs. You have rules on revising or updating NDCs. You have rules on accountability and transparency. You have rules on subsequent rounds for updating your NDCs. So you have some kind of rule structure surrounding this very flexible approach to formulating your NDC. So in terms of framing the Paris meeting, there have now been 2 COP decisions, one in Warsaw in 2013, another one in Lima last December at COP20. What the Warsaw decision said was they invited countries to communicate There are intended nationally determined contributions. There's now an idea of INDCs and NDCs. The INDCs are essentially the interim, your expected NDC, and then you're going to finalize your NDC later on. So the INDCs will essentially be replaced ultimately by the country's NDC. Countries are invited to do so well in advance of Paris. A big issue, which I'll come back to in a minute, is whether NDCs will be legally binding or not. The Warsaw decision explicitly was without prejudice to that question. That was the final issue to be decided in Warsaw. It went all night into the next day over this very question. And of course, as in any negotiation, the outcome was essentially weasel words that left everybody able to preserve their position, declare victory, and go home. And they finally reached that agreement on the Saturday after the meeting was supposed to end. The Lima decision last December essentially provided some guidance to countries on the formulation of their NDCs and what information they had to provide. Because one of the questions, as I said, with Copenhagen, or problems with Copenhagen, was countries didn't provide enough information for you even to know what the NDC meant. So the idea for the Paris process is INDCs need to be accompanied by enough information at least to be able to understand what gases are covered, what sectors are covered, what, if there's a base year, what the base year is, against which emission reductions are measured, if it's a BAU target, how you're calculating the business as usual trajectory. So enough information to be able to actually look at the pledge and understand what a country is actually saying they're going to do. And then a few parameters that were agreed to that I think are going to be reflected then in the Paris Agreement. INDCs are supposed to be a progression beyond your current undertaking. So whatever you already said you're going to do under Copenhagen, whatever you said you're going to do under Copenhagen, you've got to, you can't backslide. You've got to go forward from Copenhagen. And this actually has important implications that I'll come back to in a full depth for differentiation, the issue of differentiation, because there already is differentiation in the Copenhagen Cancun pledges. Developed countries have quantitative targets, economy-wide targets. Developing countries in most cases don't. If Paris has to be a progression from that, then developed countries are going to have, again, quantitative economy-wide targets. Developing countries won't necessarily have to do that. So the very idea of progression itself, in a sense, carries forward, without saying so, the differentiation that already exists in what countries have said they're going to do under Paris. Under Copenhagen. And then the agreement is to reflect the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances. This was a formulation that was adopted for the first time in the US-China joint announcement from a year ago. This is now a refinement on the concept of CBDR-RC. The US problem with CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, is that it's been interpreted in this very rigid way, unchanging way. So what the world looked like in 1992 in terms of the division of countries developed or developing, Annex 1 or non-Annex 1, has never changed since 1992, even though the actual situation has changed immensely. The idea of adding CBDR-RC in light of different national circumstances to try to take account of changes in national circumstances over time. This was the formulation worked out on how to deal with differentiation between the US and China. I think it's highly likely that this formulation will be the one that finds its way into the Paris Agreement, because if the US and China agree to this, it's likely other countries will too. There was actually just recently a joint declaration, I don't know if you saw it, between the French president and the Chinese premier, because Hollande was just visiting Beijing. So there was a France-China joint communique a couple days ago, and again, it repeated the same language. So we're sort of beginning to see, and it was in the Lima decision as well. So I think this is the new formulation of the principle of differentiation. Okay, so let me just walk through a little bit what's happening for Paris. So first of all, intended nationally determined contribution. The Secretariat just issued about a week ago, a synthesis report on the INDCs that have been communicated to date. They cover about 150 countries, representing about 90% of global emissions. I think in the Secretariat report, they said if you take into account all gases, it really covers about 80% of emissions, about 80% of emissions, but still very broad coverage. Most have some kind of emission reduction target. 58 of these are absolute targets. Some of them are intensity-based. Quite a few of them are projected relative to business as usual projections, so it's a reduction against what would happen in the absence of an agreement. Almost all of them are for the period up to 2030, but a few of them deal with a period just up to 2025, including the US. 61 of them are partly or fully conditional on support, so developing country INDCs often say what we're going to do is conditional on getting financial assistance. And quite a few of them, interestingly, anticipate using market mechanisms. So I think one question for this group is what's going to happen to the market mechanisms from Kyoto and the new agreement? I think it's highly likely there's going to be at least some recognition of markets in the new agreement because so many INDCs are basically premised on markets, so it's very difficult to leave markets out of Paris at this point. So how is the Paris deal shaping up at this point, 4 weeks before the Paris meeting is going to be held? Well, I think it's first of all going to be a package with a number of different elements. A core agreement, some kind of ancillary instrument to house the NDCs countries have, the nationally determined contributions, a COP decision adopted at Paris, and then some things are going to be left over and adopted in future COP decisions. Possibly a political declaration. This doesn't get a lot of discussion at the moment because everybody wants an outcome that's not a political declaration, but a fallback, definitely a fallback like Copenhagen, is if you can't get agreement on something more, at least have a political declaration among those countries willing to sign on. And Copenhagen, by the way, wasn't the first time this technique was used. COP2, the second conference of the parties in Geneva, had the Geneva Declaration, and that was basically the function of the fact they couldn't get agreement because a number of countries were blocking consensus in Geneva. This isn't really remembered much. So the countries that wanted to move forward on Kyoto just issued a declaration that they signed on to. So there's a tradition, there's a history of this in the past that if you can't get, you need consensus to adopt anything in the COP. It now seems to be the case that a single country can't block, so consensus doesn't mean everyone. But if 3 or 4 countries, as Copenhagen illustrated, if 3 or 4 countries object, then you don't have an agreement. So you can have 190 countries wanting to adopt the Paris Agreement, and if 4 or 5 countries object, then you're not going to get a Paris Agreement. So political declaration in that context offers at least a fallback kind of outcome. So in terms of the core agreement, I think there was some question initially as to whether this would be a legally binding agreement. I think there's now not much question that this will be a legally binding agreement, what they call a treaty in international law. And it's going to be a legal agreement regardless of what it's called. Some countries don't want to call it a protocol. In the US, protocol is a toxic word. So it's likely to be called the Paris Agreement or possibly the Paris Implementing Agreement, but it's still a treaty. I think there's no question it's going to be a treaty in international law. And one thing to keep in mind here, which I'll come back to in a minute, is that even though it's a treaty, even though it's legally binding as a matter of international law, not every element of treaties necessarily has to be itself legally binding. Treaties can include non-binding provisions as well as binding provisions. So there's a great ability to modulate exactly what the legal force of different provisions is. You can have the treaty, which provides it to be legally binding as a whole, but then particular elements of it don't have to be legally binding. All right, so some of the issues with the timing, with the structure, is what has to be decided in Paris, what can be put off for the future. There's only 4 weeks left. There's a hugely complicated text at the moment. The negotiators really have their work cut out just to finish the basic text that they can adopt in Paris. So a lot of stuff's going to have to be left over for future COPs. So the question is, what is essential for Paris to make Paris credible? What's essential? And I think what's essential is some basic agreement with a COP decision surrounding it. There's a question as to what goes in the core agreement and what can go in COP decisions. If you want something to be legally binding, it needs to be in the core agreement or provided for in the core agreement, because the core agreement is the only thing that's going to itself be legally binding. If you want something, on the other hand, to be changeable over time, if you think it's going to require revision on a frequent basis, you need to put it in the COP decision because the core agreement is going to be more difficult to amend than COP decisions are. So this is, I think, what the Paris outcome looks like from a structural standpoint. So you've got the COP decision, I put the political declaration a question mark as an alternative. The COP decision will adopt the Paris Agreement. We'll have something referencing the INDCs that have been put forward to date. decisions elaborating the agreement, providing more specificity, but rules that can be amended more easily through future COP decisions. Something on what's called Workstream 2, which is trying to increase effort up to 2020, and then interim arrangements, like what's going to happen before the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. And then there'll be, in the COP agreement, some kind of ancillary instrument to, that should say house NDCs, not INDCs, ancillary instrument to have the NDCs, and then future COP decisions to elaborate things that can't be decided in Paris. In terms of the long-term vision, I think Paris will reaffirm the 2-degree goal that was adopted in Copenhagen and Cancun. It may supplement that with some kind of long-term decarbonization or zero net emission goal. That's, I think, still up in the air. I think it could go either way. On mitigation, NDCs, as I say, will be the core of mitigation in the Paris Agreement. There's going to be a lot of flexibility countries have in defining their NDCs. They're likely, I think, to be in Paris, and this will be a core feature of Paris, procedural requirements on countries to formulate, submit, maintain, and regularly update their NDCs. So there'll be procedural requirements on countries relating to their NDCs. And in fact, the agreement may require you to submit an NDC at the time you ratify as a condition of becoming a party. That's, I think, still unclear. But it may be that if you don't have an NDC, you simply are not going to be able to join in the first place. In terms of the legally binding character of NDCs, that's an open issue. Will the NDCs be legally binding? If the agreement says not simply that you have to submit an NDC and update it, but that you actually have to implement or achieve your NDC, then arguably the NDCs will be legally binding. You will have a legal obligation to essentially substantively do something related to your NDC. This is one of the big issues in the negotiations. U.S. does not want NDCs to be legally binding. Basically, I think largely for purposes of the U.S. being able to join the agreement. If the NDC is legally binding, then arguably the U.S. can't join without getting the Senate to approve, which will not happen. So if the U.S. is going to join an agreement, then the NDCs, I think, can't be legally binding. So that's the big issue. I think eventually it'll be resolved that they are not legally binding, because I don't think that many countries really care about it that much. And I don't actually care about it that much, even though I'm a lawyer, because a lot of people think legally binding makes a huge difference. But in fact, academic research is very inconclusive as to how much difference legally binding makes. Many people say, well, if it's legally binding, it provides a greater assurance of compliance, and I think that's true. But legal bindingness doesn't assure compliance. Many other things contribute to compliance, like transparency provisions, review provisions, which can apply even if the NDC is not legally binding. And legally binding, I think, has a downside, which is it discourages ambition and participation. I don't think the U.S. would come forward with a minus 26 to 28 target, for example, if they thought that target was going to be legally binding. It's a stretch. You might not make it, and if you might not make it, then you want to be very conservative if it's legally binding and not go too far. So the NDCs, I think, will likely be housed outside the agreement, so they won't be part of the agreement. They'll be in some registry, although that's still an open issue. The agreement may specify some parameters for what your NDC has to look like. Perhaps that it has to be quantifiable, that it has to be in part unconditional. You can't say everything you're going to do is conditioned on support. You have to say you're going to do something even without support. I think there'll likely be some principle of progression that over time your NDCs have to increase in their ambition. And I think the agreement's likely to specify an ongoing cycle of contribution, so it's not going to be a one-shot deal. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's going to be an updating process. On differentiation, the NDCs themselves implicitly involve differentiation because each country decides what it's going to do. So there's the idea of self-differentiation here, where countries on their own are differentiating simply by what they come forward with in their NDCs. I think the agreement's very unlikely to include what they call explicit differentiations, or actually lists of countries where some countries do X, other countries do Y. It's not going to look like the Kyoto Protocol in my view, but it may include some kind of principles or qualifiers that are relevant, such as the developed countries should take the lead. That could be included, for example. The idea of progression, which implicitly includes differentiation, because there already is differentiation. So if everybody progresses from where they are now, there's going to be then some continued differentiation going forward. On ambition, As I said, the INDCs that have been put forward so far do not put us on a pathway to 2 degrees. So this slide is showing here, this is the usual pathway. This is the range of what the INDCs add up to that have been put on the table so far, and these are the kind of pathways we need to get to 2 degrees. So you can see the INDCs are an improvement from business as usual. It's not that Paris is doing nothing, but they still fall well short of getting us on a 2-degree pathway. So an important part of Paris is to try to build in some process to try to ratchet up ambition over time. So there's going to be, I think, a cycle of contributions where every 5 years there'll be a global stock taking, which will assess the progress that's been made so far, and will then provide the context for countries to come forward with updated NDCs. And then if there's a principle of progression, then taking into account the global stock taking, the idea is that over time, countries will ratchet up their NDCs going forward. And that, you know, you may never close the ambition gap completely, but you'll at least have rising ambition and greater impact on the climate. Likely, the Paris field will have some provisions on transparency and accountability. That's a key part of this idea of a facilitative approach. So right now there's a bifurcated transparency system where one system applies to developed countries, another one to developing countries. I think probably the biggest issue in transparency is, will the new system be bifurcated? 2 systems, one for developed and one for developing, or will it be a common transparency framework? Given the opposition to explicit differentiation by many countries these days, I think it's likely there'll be a common, not a bifurcated transparency system, but there'll be some provisions that allow for essentially self-differentiation as with NDCs, where countries can take into account their national circumstances in complying with the transparency provisions. Markets. So there's a range of, I did a paper with some Harvard economists on markets in the Paris Agreement. It was for IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. And so we identified sort of a range of things that the Paris Agreement could do in terms of what we call here linkage. But linkage is essentially linking national policies. So it's the new word that's used often now for trading or for some kind of market-based mechanisms. So you could have some actual prohibition, silence, authorizing linkage, but no rules. You could provide some kind of rule-based structure. And I think we'll fall somewhere in this range where there'll be some recognition of markets or linkage, some recognition. There's not going to be time to agree to some kind of specific rules, but there'll probably be some kind of process going forward to elaborate the rules dealing with markets. Biggest question relating to markets is the problem of double counting. If you have ability to trade between countries, you don't want one country to be counting an emission reduction and another country also to be counting the same emission reduction. So you need some system, like Kyoto has, to track the emission reductions to make sure the same emission reduction doesn't show up in 2 different countries' reports about what they're doing. Adaptation, there's a huge amount of political importance in having equal time for adaptation and mitigation. So there's certainly going to be a lot of lip service pays to adaptation. My guess is there's going to be a lot less specific on adaptation in the agreement. Likely to be some very general kind of global goal about increasing resilience. I think the core of adaptation is going to be trying to encourage, facilitate, and support national adaptation planning process that already is there, but this will probably try to ratchet up the pressure for that. And there may be a requirement, for example, that everybody has to submit an adaptation communication as part of the agreement. On finance, finance is, I think, one of the 2 issues that has the biggest potential to bring the agreement to a halt, to break down the negotiations, because developing countries want a quantitative finance goal. Developed countries do not want to have a quantitative finance goal. I'm not sure exactly what the compromise on that question is, so that's one that could be a deal breaker. I think one thing, though, that the new agreement will do is to not simply be having donors be annexed to countries as Western industrialized countries. There'll be an enlargement of the donor base. There'll be a recognition about contributions from many more countries. And this was actually part of the China-France joint communique, was about enlarging the donor base. So China is, for example, on board with this concept. So finally, my last slide. Why does Paris matter? So the outcome, I think, certainly is going to be modest. It's going to fall short in 2 criteria. INDCs are not going to put us on a pathway to, NDCs are not going to put us on a pathway to the 2-degree goal. The targets won't be legally binding in all likelihood. In my view, the second is not as important. But I think Paris is still important because it can establish a framework that hopefully will be durable, more durable than what we've had up until now, that can provide at least a basis for, over time, the ratcheting up effort by providing for countries to come forward on a regular basis, review what they're doing, say what they're going to do for the next phase. Global stock taking is then to measure what countries are doing against what needs to be done, a transparency system to see whether what countries say they're going to do they're actually doing, whether they're actually carrying out their pledges. And so over time, I think this has the potential, at least, as concerned about climate change bills, to provide a framework that can provide for a ratcheting up of effort. So it's not going to get the job done right away, but at least I think it represents a hopeful start for a new process. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you for your attention and be happy to answer questions.